Hi, my name is Gary Schnell, and I'd like to invite you into my home once again near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where I have been doing a series of YouTube videos in an effort to highlight different areas of my book. Consciousness, all in one and one in all. Today I will be focusing on chapter 13, entitled Attention and Neuroplasticity. I'm going to be making the argument that we can change the functioning of the material elements of our brain by exercising the non-material mind. So I'd like to start out looking at three elements of our mind: attention, intention, and free will. Now, attention is that to which we turn our awareness when we exercise an intention using our free will. Now, the meaning of free will has been debated for centuries, until 1988, when a fellow named Libet, L-I-B-E-T, decided he would study free will from a scientific standpoint. All he really had available to him at the time was the technology of EEGs, electroencephalograms. So what he would do is he would hook people up to an EEG, and then he would ask them to think of a movement and pursue a movement of a muscle. What he found using the EEG is that anywhere from 0.4 to 4 seconds prior to the movement, there was a negative spike in the EEG that he referred to as the readiness potential. Now, he further refined this and learned that in general, we don't become aware of the intention to move until about 100 to 200 milliseconds prior to the movement. So there is this implicit act, if you will, to move the muscle that we then don't become aware of until just before we move the muscle, and then we move the muscle. So this readiness potential is not a command from our consciousness to our muscle. It's too long of a period of time. And indeed, the period of time really is about 100 to 200 milliseconds, though our brain is registering a change at about 550 milliseconds. He referred to this gap between the awareness to move the muscle and movement of muscle as the free won't. Now, what can happen during this gap then is that we can decide whether or not we are going to exercise this implicit command or not. So at this juncture, we make an unconscious implicit choice, and then that choice is refined when we become aware of it in that 100 to 200 milliseconds prior to the movement of whether or not we wish to pursue that choice. Another choice, if you will, although this one's a conscious choice. He called this time between the implicit decision and the action the conscious mental force, CMF, that there's some kind of energy involved in this unconscious choice and in the choice to move. Now, this was refined later with newer technology, I believe in 2006, by a fellow named John Dylan Haynes, Haynes. He had newer technology available to him, and using fMRIs, he determined that there was anywhere from a 0.7 to 7 second gap between this readiness potential and the actual movement. And again, he found that there was not a conscious knowledge of making this movement until shortly before it was made. Now, he would have people in the fMRI machine, and then he would ask them to decide to move their right hand or left hand to move a button that was placed in the fMRI such that they could reach it. And he found that he could predict with 60% accuracy whether a person was going to use their left hand or their right hand. And he called into question, because he could predict such a thing, and that such a thing was, he could predict it before anyone was consciously aware of which hand they were going to use. He called into question this whole idea of free will or free won't. Now, I would ask the listener to be aware that when Haynes is doing these studies, It is a scientifically sterile choice that he's asking people to make. It's not fraught with all of the information that we process on a regular basis with each decision we make continually. It's just a simple scientific choice. Push the button with one hand or push it with the other. And I want to say that if I, in that 7-second lapse between this unconscious implicit choice and the actual movement of a hand whereby he thinks he can predict which hand is going to be used, if I go out and pull a fire alarm, I guarantee you that the person that's in that fMRI machine is going to scurry out of that fMRI machine, regardless of which hand they were going to use. In other words, I have added a source of information that now changes the paradigm. And this is the kind of thing that we do on a daily basis with all of our choices. So I think the idea that Dylan Haynes could do away with the notion of free will is specious. Now, along came a child psychiatrist, and I love child psychiatrists. His name is Jeffrey Schwartz. He's a child psychiatrist still working at UCLA, and he had an area of expertise in OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. Now, what is involved with OCD is that people who have OCD, they have these unwanted thoughts that intrude into their minds. Now, we all have unwanted thoughts that intrude into our minds from time to time. Like if I'm particularly angry with my boss, unfortunately, as a child psychiatrist, I don't have many bosses. But if I'm particularly angry with a boss, I might have the fleeting thought of wanting to kill that boss. Now, I know, as most of us know, that the chances of my doing such a thing are none. And I just dismiss it out of hand. But for the person with OCD, they don't know that. They can't just dismiss it. It continues to reverberate inside their thinking. And this can involve any number of things. You know, for example, if I have thoughts of wanting to kill my boss, maybe I count the tiles on the ceiling so that I take this obsessive thought that I'm having and it causes me anxiety. And the only way I can get rid of the anxiety is to compulsively count the tiles on the ceiling. Or let's say I'm a germaphobe and I've just touched something and I'm afraid that I've got germs on my hand, which in this day and age with coronavirus is a fear that many of us have. Well, let's say that I have that fear, but I will, unlike other people, go wash my hands every time I touch something, to the point where maybe I'm washing my hands hundreds of times a day and making them very raw and very sore. That's the nature of OCD. The people that struggle with this, they have this unwanted thought. They can't get rid of it, so they get rid of it using some kind of an irrationally attached compulsive behavior. Well, Schwartz got the idea that he could develop a cognitive paradigm to take the emotion out of the obsession, so that rather than get all anxious about this unwanted thought, maybe he could neutralize that anxiety without having to neutralize it using a compulsive behavior. So he developed a series of 4 R's, and I'm just going to go through the first R to exemplify what he's trying to do. The first R is something called relabeling. And what he asks the people to do with this illness is he asks them to, every time they have an obsessive thought, he asks them to think of this as, there goes my brain again, or there goes my OCD again, or there I go again with this thinking, thereby taking all the anxiety out of it by replacing it with this awareness that this is no more than an illness, and that this is not an illness that defines them. It is an illness of their thought that has to do with the neural patterns in their brain. And indeed, he was able to watch the people's brains that struggled with this change as they pursued his cognitive exercises. He was able to watch this change using fMRIs. And indeed, he was able to observe these changes. Now, This is what we call neuroplasticity. And what we mean by neuroplasticity is that there is a change in the material matter of our brain, in our neural patterns established by our neurons, by thought, by mind, which is non-material. Now, we used to think that in medicine, back when I was going through medical school and residency, that people who suffered strokes, that was it. They were stuck. They weren't going to be able, especially if they had a stroke on the left side of their brain, they weren't going to be able to move their right hand for the rest of their lives, and they weren't going to be able to speak for the rest of their lives, because left side of the brain is where these things are started. And so, that person would be unable to move and unable to speak. But then we learned that this was not really a function that was final. We learned that there could be some reorganization, compensatory reorganization, it came to be called, whereby if we restrain the left hand of someone and force someone to move their right hand, they will be able to learn to use their right hand again. What's happening for people who struggle with strokes is, indeed, those cells are gone, but we can train other areas of the brain to take over the functioning of those old cells if we force that arm to move. And again, this is called compensatory reorganization. We used to think that this wasn't possible because we didn't think that the brain produced new cells after being born. We thought that the number of cells in the brain was constant. And indeed, for the most part, it is. We'll talk about where it isn't in just a little bit. But what's going on here isn't that we're making new cells. What's going on here is that we're reorganizing cells that are already in existence. Now, we had a sense that this might be the case. Well, we see this anyway in children who are born deaf or who are born blind. Now, children who are born deaf, they don't use the part of their brains that are associated with hearing. But children who are born deaf have a greater awareness of their surroundings, because the cells that would have been used for hearing are now being used for things that are like hearing, like our awareness of motion around us. And it's the same for people who are born blind. The cells that are used for vision are now being used for sensitivity, skin sensitivity, so that people who are born blind can be trained to do Braille much more easily than I could be. They did a few experiments to look at this beyond childhood and aside from stroke victims. And one of the things they did was they looked at the brain activities in people who played musical instruments versus those who didn't play musical instruments. They found that the people who played musical instruments had no difference from the people who didn't play musical instruments when they looked at the brain and the parts of the brain associated with movements of the right hand. But they did find significant difference between the people who played musical instruments and didn't play musical instruments when they looked at the parts of the brain that are associated with moving the left hand. What they then did was they took two groups of people. One, they taught to play a song, and the other, they taught to simply think about playing the song. What they found was there was no difference in either side of the brain associated with the left hand or the right hand between those who actually learned to play the song and those who didn't learn to play the song but just thought about it. So essentially what we're saying here is that our brain can respond and change to external stimuli like a stroke, whereby we have to move something, or to just thinking about something like playing a musical instrument. Now, we've talked a little bit about neuroplasticity in the past, and I just want to briefly touch bases again here. Neuroplasticity involves what we think is what we have previously referred to as junk DNA, an unfortunate name. But most of the DNA that we have in our cells does not code for genes. It modifies the genes that are coding for proteins and peptides and those kinds of things. What we have is things called histones. We have short chain RNAs. We have a variety of things, but the histones, DNA is wrapped around these proteins, these octamer proteins called histones. And if we add acetyl groups to these histones, it frees up the DNA to be transcribed. If we add methyl groups, it inhibits the ability to be transcribed. And what ends up happening then is that we're not really changing the DNA, we're changing the way the DNA is being transcribed, so that some DNA is being transcribed that wasn't previously being transcribed. Now, we've used neuroplasticity in a variety of things. I've indicated that we use it in stroke victims. It's used obviously in OCD. It's used in children who struggle with Tourette's. You may be aware of the movie that's been made about Tourette's for children. Tourette's does not have me, I have Tourette's. I think that's the title of it. It's along those lines. And it's an indication that children aren't a slave to this illness that we previously thought they were, that they can modify the way their brains work. We use it in dyslexia. We use it in depression. It's quite possibly effective in Parkinson's. At least it has been effective in animal studies with Parkinson's and in Huntington's, whereby we look at enriched environments like walking for people with Parkinson's, and we look for animals with Parkinson's, and we find that enriching the environment makes a change in the severity of their illness. So paying attention to what Schwartz asked people to attend to, or paying attention to moving a right arm versus a left arm, or paying attention to learning a musical instrument versus thinking about a musical instrument. Paying attention is a property of the mind, but it has a direct effect on the matter, the material, the cells of the brain. Now, we exercise this ability to focus our attention throughout the day. If I'm pursuing talking, there are other parts of my brain that aren't as active. I'm not attending to those areas in the brain, so those areas just aren't as active. If I'm not talking, if I'm thinking about something, the areas that are associated with speech, those areas aren't as active. So what we look at doing is focusing our attention. And is there anything that we can change when we focus our attention? So one of the things that can be done, for example, is we can look at the idea of meditation or mindfulness. And by paying attention over a period of time as we attempt to be mindful, we might be able to change some of the wiring from our amygdala to the frontal cortex and allow it to be more from the hippocampus through the insula into the frontal cortex, where it is then not as anxiety provoking. We pay attention to our breath, for example, which is a function of part of our nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, our breathing, our heart rate, as opposed to our fight or flight response, which is our sympathetic nervous system that involves the amygdala. And in doing so, we can promote relaxation. And what we're doing is we are rewiring our brain using something called Hebb's rule. Neurons that fire together by paying attention, and if I pay attention for a long period of time, these neurons will fire together more and more. Neurons that fire together wire together. This has resulted in something that has come to be called the body-mind, one word, body-mind, by Candace Pert. Now, it was thought that it might be worthwhile looking at, since I've talked about focus and concentration and relaxation with meditation, it might be worth looking at, emotions and what part they might play in this thing we call body mind. There were a number of animal studies that were done, and one involved rat pups, whereby what we see is that pups that were groomed more by their mothers tended to be less anxious, less fearful, whereas pups that were groomed less by their mothers tended to be more fearful, more anxious. And then they took the pups that were more fearful and they put them in with the mothers that groomed more. They found that if they put the pups that were more anxious and had been groomed less in with mothers who groomed more, they could make these pups less anxious. And they also found that when these pups that they made less anxious by putting them in with mothers that groomed more had offspring, they tended to groom more and have less anxious pups. So this wasn't just something that changed for the moment. It was something that was passed down. Indeed, the DNA was no different. It was just being transcribed differently. What they found was rats who were less fearful had what's called cortical releasing factor, or CRF. Now, CRF is something that is released by the hippocampus, and it goes to the hypothalamus, where it causes the release of ACTH. ACTH then circulates, and it leads to the release of cortisol by the adrenal glands. Now, this cortisol then can go back to the hippocampus and bind in the hippocampus, and the receptors of the hippocampus then that are bound will cause the hippocampus to release less of the CRF, such that the hippocampus is the thing that keeps us from becoming overstressed. It's a nice little feedback loop. They found that they could make the hippocampus more sensitive to the circulation of cortisol by injecting something that caused increased acetylation into the brain cavities of the anxious rats and decreased their anxiety. And indeed, what they were doing was they injected something that increased the acetylation so that the genes that caused the formation of these cortisol receptors in the hippocampus, they could turn them on such that the hippocampus then becomes, because it has more receptors, it becomes more sensitive to the circulating cortisol. As it does so, then it helps us to be even less anxious because it's so much more sensitive. There are a number of animal studies that are consistent with these findings, but I'd like to move into what this might mean for people, how we understand stress. Now, some time ago, a psychologist from Madison, Richie Davidson, who is quite famous for looking at the EEGs of Dalai Lama's monks, as well as doing fMRI studies on them, he did a study that involved 3-year-olds, 7-year-olds, and 9-year-olds. And he found that he could basically categorize them into 3 groups: a shy group, a middle-of-the-road group, and a bold group. He found that when he followed these groups over time, children who were once shy could become bold, and people who were once bold could become shy. So, for example, there was a particularly bold boy, 3-year-old, and between the age of 3 and 9, his father had died. Well, indeed, by the time he was 9 years old, missing his father, he was less bold. Now, his DNA hadn't changed. What had changed was the expression of the DNA, and he just was more shy. We started to look at, okay, is there something we can actively do to enhance our ability to relax? And along came this doctor out of Harvard named Herbert Benson in the mid-1990s, and he developed something called the relaxation response. And what this involves really is about 20 minutes of mindfulness or meditation. And it was found that we could lower the blood pressure in people who had high blood pressure. We could decrease the symptoms of rheumatoid arthritis in those struggling with that. And we could decrease the sense of stress that people feel. Subsequently, we were able to develop something called DNA microchips, And they found that there were a number of things that changed when people relaxed and how the DNA was expressed that was consistent with these changes. And we could look at children who were born from parents who had panic attacks versus children who were born of parents who weren't that anxious. And we could compare how their DNA was expressed. And what was found that DNA that coded for anxiety and other elements of the fight or flight response, that the children who were raised by parents who had panic attacks, they had different expression of their DNA that caused them to be more anxious than the children who weren't exposed to parents who had panic attacks. And they found this as well in depression, that there are significant changes in the release of cortisol and the expression of many of the genes in the limbic system of the brain, which is responsible for our sense of and our expression of stress. They found that there was a significant change in the expression of the DNA of people who struggled with depression. Now, all of this, and what I want to come around to is that what is going on is that we are exercising our minds. We are paying attention to different things. And by paying attention to different things, we are changing the neural patterns, the matter of our brains. And we can change it for the better by things like mindfulness, or by exercise, or by change in diet, or by being around friends, or just by smiling more. There are studies that suggest that smiling more changes the neural patterns of the brain. Or petting a dog and the release of oxytocin. That we can change our brain patterns, our neural patterns, by thinking. And I think that that is something that is worth paying attention to. This ends this talk. I want to thank you so much for listening to me, for paying attention to me, and investing your time in this. I hope it's been helpful. I would ask you to subscribe if you're interested. I would ask you, if you have any questions, to please put them out on YouTube. Thank you very much for your time. And in the meantime, be well.